Hey guys, we're sitting here with Stan Warnow, director of the great film Deconstructing Dad, about Raymond Scott. We've just been hearing some Raymond Scott tunes. Stan, welcome to Finn's Revolution on WUSB. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, thank you, and it's great to be on the air with you, and thanks so much for having me.
Oh yeah, I got to tell you, we saw this film the other night over at the Quad, where it's still playing this week, and it's an absolutely amazing film. Not just a straight documentary, but also, obviously, it's a film about your dad, Raymond Scott, and it's just, the insights are just amazing. Would you like to tell us a little about, before we talk about your dad, let's talk about what was your impetus initially for doing this film? Why'd you want to make it?
Well, as I expressed somewhat in the film, I didn't have a really close relationship with my dad when he was alive. He was so obsessed with his work, and he was uncomfortable with children in any case. So I always felt like he isn't that much interested in me, and so I'm not going to be interested in him. But then I had to give the eulogy at this small memorial service we had for him after he died, and it was small because he wasn't famous anymore. And as I started to read what I had written, kind of casually, not even thinking about it, I got all choked up, and that came as a total surprise to me. And it made me realize that I did have those deep feelings for my father that children usually do, but I had denied those for my whole adult life and most of my life before that. So it didn't take long after that for me to become really bothered by the fact that my father had been essentially forgotten by the world at large. And, of course, working in the film business, it occurred to me, well, maybe I should make a film to kind of help remedy that situation, and so I did.
And so I guess the impetus really was back in '94 when your dad passed?
Yeah, it was shortly after that. It took a while to sort of get everything off the ground, but it was within a few months after he died.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of those things. And your dad, of course, your dad and your mom were separated relatively early in your life, right?
Oh, yeah, around the time I was 9 or 10.
Okay. Well, now for people who are not as familiar, and we play Raymond Scott regularly on this program.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah. But for people who are not aware, your dad, I think generally the public might have been more aware of Raymond Scott, the public growing up in the 40s and 50s because of his work on radio, television throughout the early 60s too, I think.
Yeah.
With your hit parade, etc. But people of my generation, I think, kind of became aware of him kind of backwards through the music that through the cartoon music that he became famous for, even though he never really wrote for cartoons, but the music was licensed. So yeah, it's all that great Looney Tunes music, Ren and Stimpy, cartoons along those lines.
Yeah, The Simpsons.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little about your dad's early career for people who don't know too much about it as a musician.
Sure.
First. Yeah.
Well, he got his start, as a pianist with the CBS house band. But he wanted to begin writing music, and eventually they let him do that. And when he began performing it, it became very successful very quickly. He formed this group called the Raymond Scott Quintet, and they were whisked off to Hollywood within about 6 months of becoming a group and playing on CBS. And he was in all these different Hollywood movies, and then he came back to New York, and he had a big band, and then he came back to CBS, and one of the things he did there was form the first integrated radio network orchestra, which I had no idea about before I did the film. But he also had this whole other side. Oh, and then his music was licensed for the cartoons, as you've mentioned. So he never wrote for them, but Carl Stalling, who directed the music department for Warner Brothers Animation, loved my dad's music, and they licensed it. But my father actually had no real interest in cartoons, and I have no recollection of him ever talking about it. But what he did have a real interest in was almost his first love, really, was technology. And so he kind of combined that love of technology with his love of music and applied technology to music in many, many ways throughout his career. First starting as doing his own recordings when he was still a teenager. And then as soon as he got established as a musician in New York and could afford it, he opened up his own recording studio. And then later he saw the potential in electronic instruments, and he designed a very early keyboard synthesizer, which Robert Moog actually builds components for. This is, about 10 years before Moog's own synthesizer. Not that Moog ripped him off, because Moog's worked very differently than my dad's, but he said he was inspired by my dad in certain ways. And also my father, for the musicians out there, invented a very early sequencer, and then eventually he invented this machine. It was kind of the culmination of his work, called the Electronium, which actually composed and performed music simultaneously. So he had this very, very wide-ranging career, and he even did other things, like he invented an early fax machine at one point and patented it. He had very early multi-track recorders in his studio before Les Paul that I believe were derived from German data recorders used during the war. So he just had an incredibly wide range of abilities, talents, and projects that he was involved with.
Yeah, it seemed like his mind was always going, and he was always trying to, he had stuff in his head that he just had to make happen. In fact, you mentioned the, sequencer development.
Which all happened out on Long Island, by the way.
Right. But I mean, early, when he first was even learning the piano, essentially he learned off what could certainly be called a sequencer, which is the player piano.
Yeah. I mean, that may well have inspired, his kind of obsession with the technology of music, because he did learn by following along with the keys on the player piano. His father had a music shop. There was a player piano there, and he kind of, from the age of 2, was teaching himself to play using that piano.
Wow. And so I always, what I found really, really a particular fascinating aspect of his life that comes up in the film was his years and years, of course, as an orchestra leader and composer. First of all, of tunes we hear here on this show and other shows that are in our heads, but we don't always necessarily associate specifically with Raymond Scott. They're in our heads because they're in the culture, like Powerhouse, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in those cartoons, just the convention was at that time that composers in the cartoons did not get separate credit. Carl Stalling got credit as the music director, and he did write a whole lot of the music, probably most of it. But the music that tends to be remembered are the Raymond Scott compositions.
Yeah, and a lot of people who wind up listening to Raymond Scott and getting into it often will describe Raymond Scott as a jazz player. And even though stylistically it was all jazz, one of the things I learned from the film is that actually every part was arranged and kind of codified through rehearsals.
Yes.
You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, my dad was very controlling on many levels, and he would let his musicians improvise when they were working up a piece. But once he heard what he thought was as good as they could do it, he would say, "That's it. That's the way I want you to play it every time," which drove the musicians crazy.
Right, because
musicians, they want to improvise. So at the same time, he loved jazz. He was in a group, and when he was a pianist, called the Saturday Night Swing Club on CBS in the early years of swing. He was a great admirer of Duke Ellington and many other jazz people. So it's, I always say it's a life of paradox. There's a lot of paradoxes about his life.
Yeah. By today's standards, somebody would have called him, OCD with his obsessions and how,
definitely, and I'm a little bit that way too.
Yeah, which is it's just it's a fascinating thing, the way his mind worked and kept pushing.
Yeah.
Now what's really interesting is that with all these developments, all these inventions, all these different things he worked on, I know he applied for many patents, but ultimately he didn't wind up holding too many specific things because he was always redeveloping his work, right?
Yeah, well, the whole patent process is fairly complicated. He did end up with 6 patents, and one of them was, in fact, for that early keyboard synth, the Clavovox.
Right.
And his other patents were, he had a patent for that fax machine, which was in the 50s, I think. I forget exactly, but I think it was the 50s. And he had a patent for some of the circuitry and the electronium. He had a patent that applied to multi-track recording. And I don't think technically it was the recorder itself, but it was a way of stabilizing the tape. But as I said, he was doing that very, very early in the 50s. So he did have a certain number of patents. But the thing to remember is that a lot of patents using existing technology in different ways, are not really items that can often be patented. So Robert Moog, who invented all these great instruments, but because I think, and I'm no patent attorney, I should check this, but it's my understanding that because you're combining things that already exist, off-the-shelf hardware like oscillators and voltage controllers and whatever, you can't necessarily patent that stuff. So Moog only has one patent himself. And my dad also, he filed many, many patent disclosures, which are basically, notices that you intend to patent something, but he didn't. He didn't pursue that necessarily. Kind of that comes back to that point you're making about him doing so many different things. Yeah.
I was also very happy to learn, because I've collected some recordings over the years, and we've heard some right here of the Electronium, which is probably his premier invention in terms, and I was very happy to hear that it still physically exists, one of the Electroniums.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, and where is it now?
Well, at the moment, it's in basically in Portland, Oregon, where a volunteer is restoring it. Mark Mothersbaugh of Devo, who's a great admirer of my dad and is in the film, bought it a few years after he died because it was kind of in a garage that was leaking, and there were rats or mice, in any case, running around. And Mark really identifies with my father, and he bought that machine. And, of course, things tend to move slowly, so over the years, it took him a while to get to restoring it, but now somebody is restoring it. But it's a huge, huge project, because although we have some schematics, apparently they're for a different version than the Motown one that is in Portland, being restored by a man by the name of Darren Davison. So he's having to kind of reverse engineer everything, and then there are components that are missing. And so it's an incredibly complex project, but he has made progress, but not to the point where it's working yet.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful instrument, just all those initial designs, and a nice enlightening story I thought was Berry Gordy of Motown, his obsession with the ability to randomly generate stuff that they could use with the Electronium.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting stuff in the film, Berry Gordy. Obviously, for those of you who are not familiar, I don't know how you can't be, but you might not be. President, owner of Motown, and was very, very interested in your dad's Electronium, mainly, I think, to randomly generate material, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure of the specifics, but that certainly, yes, that must have been the thing that appealed to him the most, the idea that perhaps this thing would come up, with new riffs, new compositions that they could use, and also, it was at that time capable of making sounds that no other instruments were, and I think the thought was to incorporate them, and, nobody knows for sure whether they ever did. There are some tunes, Motown tunes, that seem to have electronics in them from that period that we think may be, but, nobody who was there and knows for sure is talking about it.
Yeah, nobody's sure what wound up where, sure.
Yeah.
Stan, I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining us. We know you have a screening to head down to right now. And, for those of you out there who would like to find out more about Raymond Scott, the film Deconstructing Dad by Stan Warnow. His son, fascinating film. You can go to Scott Docs. That's SCOTTDOC.com. Find out more about the film. But I absolutely urge you, you can pick up the DVD there on that site, a whole bunch of stuff like that. But I absolutely urge you to make it down to the Quad Cinema in the Village this week, where it is showing on the big screen and stands at most of the screenings. So head down there, check it out, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful film. Support the film. Support a film like this if you're interested in in interesting films that are outside the box. If you don't know anything about Raymond Scott, it's an amazingly entertaining film. If you want to find out more about Raymond Scott, which is why I saw the film, you will not be disappointed. There was some amazing stuff there. So thank you, Stan, and we'll see you guys at the movies. Check out the Quad. Check out scottdoc.com. Here's a little something else from Raymond Scott.